Welcome, guys, to another midnight story. But tonight is not like the others. You shouldn't have come here. The shadows are watching your every step. The wind whispers secrets you were never meant to hear. Every creak, every rustle could be your last dot. Do you feel it? The darkness moving just behind you. Welcome to the Midnight Story.
10 creepy true camping nightmares in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Horror stories. Story 1. Whispers beyond the firelight. I thought the fire would keep me safe that night. A small circle of warmth and light in the middle of the clearing. But as soon as I settled into my folding chair with my pack leaned against a nearby tree, I started to hear them. Faint, almost imperceptible whispers drifting in from the tree line. At first, I told myself it was the wind, the trees creaking and sighing in the cold mountain air. Something ordinary, nothing worth worrying about. I tried to focus on my notebook, making notes about the trail I'd hiked earlier, but the whispers persisted, like low, breathy murmurs just beyond the edge of perception. They were never loud, never clear, but I could feel their cadence, a rhythm that mimicked the movement of the wind through the pines, as though the forest itself was speaking, or worse, listening. I stood and circled the fire once, peering into the darkness beyond the glow of the flames, expecting to see another camper, maybe someone who had arrived after sunset. But the clearing was empty, and the trees remained rigid, black silhouettes against a dark sky. I laughed nervously to myself, shaking my head. It had to be nothing. Still, my ears strained, and the whispers became more distinct, the sound of words curling in and around each other in patterns I couldn't make sense of. They seemed almost conversational, not random, as if the voices were speaking to one another while I was meant to listen. I sat back down, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline, and tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that my own mind was conjuring fear where there was none. Every now and then, a shadow would shift just beyond the firelight, quick and sudden, disappearing before I could catch it fully. I froze each time, heart hammering, flashlight trembling in my grip, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The shadows never approached the fire, never made a sound beyond the whispers, but they were always there, hovering just beyond the ring of warmth. Every branch that cracked under the weight of some unseen animal sent a jolt through me, and I caught myself holding my breath, willing the sounds to stop, willing the shadows to vanish. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had no meaning out there, but the whispers never faded. They ebbed and flowed like a tide, rising when I thought I had ignored them and retreating when I tried to confront them. I remember thinking, with a kind of sick clarity, that the forest was aware of me in a way that went beyond mere observation. It was deliberate, as if something unseen was gauging my fear, testing the boundaries of my sanity. I wanted to call out, to announce my presence, but the words stuck in my throat. I was certain somehow that speaking would invite something closer, something that had been waiting all along for me to acknowledge it. I tried to distract myself, thinking of ordinary things, the path I had hiked, the stream I had passed, the small cabin at the ranger station that I would reach by morning. But the whispers had a way of weaving into thought, bending perception so that nothing felt solid, nothing was certain. Shadows twisted and pooled where they shouldn't have, and I swore I saw movement that contradicted the terrain, as if the trees themselves were stretching, leaning in to get a better view. My fire was a frail barrier, and every time I threw another log onto it, I feared that I was only buying myself a few more moments, that the forest beyond was patient, inexorable, and entirely indifferent to my existence. At some point, I stopped keeping track of the hours. I I remember rocking in my chair, flashlight clutched in one hand, pack straps digging into my shoulders, trying to find some position that didn't make me feel like I was part of the landscape, exposed to whatever watched. The whispers came in bursts now, low voices overlapping each other, rising and falling like a chant. Sometimes I thought I caught a word, a fragment of a sentence, but it never lasted long enough to make sense. I could feel the residue of it clinging to my thoughts, a cold persistence that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Once, I thought I saw a figure in the trees, just a glimpse, dark and thin, with limbs too long and movements too deliberate to be a deer or raccoon. It vanished before I could blink, leaving only a tremor of doubt and a tightening in my chest. Every instinct screamed that I should leave, pack up and run, but I couldn't move. Something held me there, something like fascination mixed with fear, and I was aware with a slow sinking dread that the forest knew this. It knew that I couldn't just walk away. I was entangled now, caught in the current of its attention. When I finally noticed the first threads of dawn, pale and trembling over the horizon, the whispers didn't stop immediately. They receded, gradually retreating into the folds of the mountains, leaving a silence so absolute that it hurt to hear. I packed my chair and my bag quickly, hands shaking, not daring to look into the woods more than necessary. And yet, even as I walked toward the trailhead, I could feel their presence lingering in my peripheral vision, in the shifting shapes of the trees, in the faint rustle of leaves behind me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was only the forest, only the wind, but I couldn't entirely shake the sensation that the forest had spoken to me, and that the words it had used would echo forever in my mind. Even now, months later, I find myself startled by the wind brushing against the window, or by the soft crack of a branch in the yard at night. I catch myself listening for a rhythm, a murmur, a cadence I shouldn't recognize, and I wonder if somehow those voices followed me out of the mountains. The memory of that night sits heavy in me, like ashes that have refused to settle, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I can see the firelight flicker again, and just beyond it, in the blackness, shadows shift, watching patiently, waiting for me to return. The whispers never made sense, never formed coherent words, and yet their presence was real, insistent, like a warning I could not interpret. The mountains, in their indifferent stillness, had marked me, and I can still feel the weight of that mark whenever I am in quiet places, anywhere with trees bending in wind and darkness pooling in corners. It was not a story I tell for thrills, it is memory, and memory is stubborn, and memory holds on far longer than we wish it would. I have not returned, and I do not intend to. The firelight was fragile, the circle I thought protected me only an illusion, but the whispers, they remain, slithering in the mind, just beyond comprehension, always at the edge of my hearing. Story 2, Footsteps in the Fog. I'd been hiking all afternoon, taking a back trail I hadn't used in years, winding along the ridge above the valley where I had set up camp the night before. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees, when suddenly a thick fog rolled down from the mountainside, settling over the trail like a living thing. One moment I could see 10 feet in front of me. The next, I could barely make out my own boots. The air felt damp and heavy, clinging to my skin, and every snap of a twig underfoot echoed far louder than it should have. I slowed my pace, thinking I might just wait it out, but that's when I heard it, the faintest crunch behind me, deliberate and paced exactly with my own steps. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. The footsteps stopped when I stopped. I tried to tell myself it was another hiker, maybe some latecomer heading back to camp, but the trail was narrow and rarely used. I whispered, "Hello," but my voice seemed swallowed by the fog. The sound started again, shuffling behind me, never getting closer but never fading, always perfectly synchronized with mine. Panic began to rise in my chest. I turned quickly, swinging my flashlight through the fog, but it revealed nothing. Nothing but grey mist and the occasional glint of dew on the leaves. I began to jog, the rhythmic thud of my boots matching the footsteps behind me, the sound relentless. I tried breaking into a run, heart hammering against my ribs, but the trail twisted and dropped sharply in places, forcing me to slow. Every time I glanced back, I saw nothing, and yet the steps never stopped. I tried shouting again, calling out for whoever or whatever it was, but my voice vanished into the fog. The trees loomed closer together, their dark trunks like silent watchers, and the mist seemed to thicken around me, dampening sound, swallowing light, pressing against my skin like the forest itself was alive. Finally, after what felt like hours but must have been only minutes, I stumbled into the clearing where my tent stood. Relief crashed over me, sharp and overwhelming. The sight of the familiar canvas, anchored to the ground, should have calmed me. Instead, my stomach knotted into a cold, twisting dread. The flap of the tent had been disturbed. No way it could have happened naturally. Small, muddy footprints circled it in patterns that made no sense, looping back and forth, overlapping, as if someone, or several someones, had been pacing, watching, waiting. I dropped my pack, fumbling for my flashlight, and scanned the surrounding tree line. Nothing moved, no rustle of leaves, no snap of a branch, no eyes reflecting the light. Only the fog, thick and still, curling around the edges of the clearing like it was part of the ground itself. I spent the next hour pacing, listening, gripping my hiking knife as though it would do anything against whatever had followed me. Every sound, the faint crack of a branch, the rustle of underbrush, the distant call of a crow, sent my nerves flaring. I tried to tell myself it had been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox, but the pattern of the footprints, the timing of the steps, nothing fit. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched the entire way back, that eyes had tracked my every movement through the fog. I wanted to scream, to leave, but the trail down to the main road was too far, too dark, and I was certain I wasn't meant to leave yet. Night pressed down over the mountains. I tried to sleep in the tent, curled up in my sleeping bag, but the fog still hugged the clearing, pressing against the thin walls of canvas. Occasionally I thought I heard soft shuffles outside, scraping noises, the faintest whisper of movement around the tent. I pulled the bag over my head, trying to drown it out, but it was impossible. Each sound made my pulse spike, made my imagination spiral, and I kept thinking of the footsteps on the trail, the precise, deliberate cadence that had matched mine, that had never wavered. I had never felt so completely, utterly alone. When dawn finally came, the fog lifted slowly, leaving the clearing bathed in pale, weak light. I stepped outside cautiously, expecting to see the footprints still lingering, proof of my terror. But there was nothing. The earth was smooth, as though it had never been disturbed. The tent flap hung as I had left it, my pack untouched. I looked back along the trail, hoping to see some sign, some explanation, but the ridge was empty. No other hiker, no animal tracks, nothing. Just the forest, quiet and indifferent, and the lingering chill in my bones. I packed my gear silently, every sound of zipper and snap jarring in the clearing. The forest seemed to watch me as I retraced the trail down the mountain, every shadow holding a memory of those footsteps, every gust of wind a whisper of something unseen. I told myself it was fear, that the fog and isolation had made my mind invent things, but the memory of the footsteps, so deliberate, so precise, was burned into me. I could still hear them in the quiet, in the rustle of leaves, in the echo of my own steps when I walked alone later, years down the road. I never camped alone in those mountains again. I avoid the trails at dusk. and I never go out when fog is rolling down the ridges. Sometimes when the wind is right, I swear I can hear it, the sound of footsteps keeping pace, always following, always patient. They are not fast, not violent, just there, reminding me that some part of the forest keeps track, keeps watch, and waits. I've told this story to friends, laughed it off, but I know what I felt that night, and I know I was not imagining it. The mountains are beautiful, wild, and deadly in ways we rarely see, and the fog, well, the fog remembers. Even now, thinking back, I can feel my chest tighten. Hear the thud of those steps behind me as clearly as if they were happening again. And I know that somewhere in those ridges, something moves silently, always in time with the world, always watching, and always patient enough to wait for the next soul to wander into its fog. Story 3. The Cabin That Shouldn't Exist. I had been hiking this section of the forest countless times over the years, taking the old ridge trail that only locals seem to remember, a narrow path that twisted through thick underbrush and knotted roots. That morning, the sky was overcast, and a damp chill hung in the air as I made my way along the trail, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. I had been moving slowly, letting the quiet of the woods settle over me, when something caught my eye between the trees. A shape I didn't expect. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. The sun was hidden behind clouds, and the shadows shifted in ways that made branches look like figures. But then I saw it more clearly. A small cabin tucked into a curve of the ridge I had passed a dozen times before, yet never noticed. It looked abandoned. The wood warped and grey with age, but there was something about it that made my stomach tighten. The windows were dark, clouded with grime, and the roof sagged slightly, though not enough to suggest total collapse. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, my curiosity warring with a strange, prickling sense of dread. Something compelled me forward, the sort of pull you can't quite explain, and I found myself stepping up onto the porch, noticing that the door was ajar, blackness inside swallowing the weak light of the day. The air smelled stale and heavy, a mixture of damp wood and rot that made my throat tighten. I stepped inside carefully, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. Dust motes floated lazily in the narrow beam, settling on furniture that had been long forgotten. Chairs were overturned. A small table sat cracked and splintered, but everything seemed preserved as if frozen in time. Then I noticed the photograph hanging crookedly on the wall above the mantel. My heart stopped. It was a family portrait, sepia-toned and faded, but the people in it were unmistakable. My own family. My grandparents, my parents, even my younger siblings. All staring solemnly from the frame. The oddest thing was the age of the image. It seemed impossibly old, the faces lined with age and yet unchanging, impossible for the timeline of my own memory. I backed away, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, and the silence in the cabin pressed down like a weight. I left the cabin reluctantly, the forest outside seeming almost unnaturally still. The trees bent slightly with the wind, the air cool and damp, but the usual chorus of birds and insects was absent. I set up my tent in a small clearing nearby, trying to shake the unease, telling myself I had stumbled across some forgotten homestead, perhaps a historical cabin left off the maps. But as night fell, the quiet of the forest felt oppressive, and the shadows seemed to stretch closer to the tent. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the faint creak of a door, just like the one in the cabin. I froze, listening. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, then a shuffle across the floorboards. I wanted to convince myself it was a deer or some other forest creature, but the rhythm was wrong, too purposeful, too controlled. I stayed in my sleeping bag, heart hammering, staring at the dark tree line that seemed unnaturally close. Every minute stretched into hours, the noises returning in intervals. A soft scrape, the barely audible shift of wood, the door creaking once more. I considered leaving, packing up in the pitch-black forest and hiking back to the main trail. But a strange pull held me there. The fog had rolled in silently, and the visibility dropped to mere feet. Even with my flashlight, the forest felt like it had contracted, closing around me. I tried to tell myself it was all a trick of the mind, stress and imagination conjuring noises in the dark, yet the dread in my chest felt real, solid, pressing against my lungs. By dawn, the fog had lifted, and I stepped out of my tent shaking and cold, expecting the cabin to loom in the clearing like it had the night before. But when I looked, there was nothing. The trees and underbrush were intact, as if the clearing had never held a structure at all. No porch, no walls, no roof, nothing but the forest itself. I circled the area, scanning for any trace. A nail, a plank, a footprint, anything to confirm what I had seen. But the ground was smooth and undisturbed, covered in leaves and morning dew. The memory of the photograph, the stale air, the creaking doors lingered in my mind like a scar. I didn't speak of it to anyone at first, afraid they would think I had lost my mind. Later, I told a friend who knew the backwoods well, and he laughed it off, saying that old cabins sometimes vanish when they aren't visited, collapse and get swallowed by the forest over decades. But it wasn't that. I remembered the details too vividly. The smell, the furniture, the photograph. Those were not things that could simply disappear without a trace. I never returned to that trail, but I still think about it, especially when I walk in thick woods elsewhere, when fog curls over the ground in the late afternoon. I can feel the pull of that place again, the sense that something is always waiting, patient, in the folds of the forest. Even now, the image of the cabin and the faces in that photograph haunt me. I wonder, when I see a tree bending with the wind, or a shadow that lingers too long, if I am catching glimpses of that space again, an echo of a cabin that never existed, or a memory I was never meant to see. The forest is full of stories like that, whispers of places that shouldn't exist, and while most go unnoticed, sometimes you stumble upon them, and you realize the woods remember more than we ever could. And perhaps some things in the mountains are meant to be left unseen, their existence a quiet, pressing warning, that even familiar landscapes can hold mysteries that never truly let you go. Story 4. The sound of screaming pines. I had set up my tent in a small clearing nestled against a dense stand of pine trees, drawn to the spot by the isolation and the quiet beauty of the ridge. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of needles and damp earth, and the late autumn sun had just dipped behind the mountains when I finished unpacking. I spent the evening cooking over a small camp stove, the sounds of sizzling food mingling with the distant call of a lone crow. As night fell, the forest seemed to close in around me, the canopy above thickening, muffling the wind. It was the kind of solitude I usually cherished, the kind that lets you feel like the world has narrowed to just you and the rhythm of your own breathing. But that night, the rhythm I expected was broken. Around midnight, a sudden gust swept through the grove, rattling branches and sending a shiver down my spine. That's when I heard it. The first scream. It was high-pitched, desperate and inhuman in its clarity. My heart jumped. I thought it might be a deer caught in a trap, or some unfortunate animal struggling in the underbrush, but then it came again, followed by another, from a different direction entirely. The sound seemed to bounce between the trees, impossible to locate, echoing and overlapping in ways that made my head spin. I froze, ears straining, trying to reconcile what I was hearing with what I knew of the forest. The screams weren't random, they were deliberate, pained, human in timbre, but impossible to trace. I unzipped my tent flap cautiously, peering into the darkness. The wind had shifted, tossing the pines like restless spirits. Every attempt to walk toward the source ended in confusion. The trees themselves seemed to rearrange. Paths that should have led somewhere twisted back on themselves, underbrush blocking every approach. Each time I thought I had narrowed down the sound, it would split. Another cry coming from a different angle. My stomach clenched as I realized I was utterly lost in a familiar grove I had thought I knew like the back of my hand. The forest wasn't just silent, it had become a living labyrinth, reshaping itself around me and mocking my attempts to understand. I returned to my tent, hands shaking, the screams now a constant chorus, threading in and out like the pulse of some vast, unseen organism. I huddled inside my sleeping bag, listening to each cry with a rising sense of helplessness. The night pressed down, thick and suffocating, and even the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat seemed loud in comparison to the whispers of the wind and the sharp cries of whatever haunted those pines. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it must be some trick of sound carried by the trees, some combination of wind and echoes that created a horrifying illusion. But the screams had weight, urgency. They carried meaning, pain, and fear that no trick of acoustics could fully mimic. Hours passed like hours, though time felt distorted in the endless night. Each gust of wind, each subtle crack of a branch made me flinch, certain that the next scream would come from just outside the tent, that whatever I could not see would finally make itself known. I could feel the forest leaning in, oppressive and attentive, a quiet menace pressing against the canvas of my shelter. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I just lay there, counting my breaths, trying to convince myself the night would end. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the screaming stopped. Not gradually, not fading, just stopped. The silence was thick, almost heavier than the cries had been, leaving me listening to my own ragged breathing, trying to convince myself the ordeal was over. Dawn broke slowly, thin sunlight filtering through the fog that had rolled down the mountains overnight. I stepped out of my tent, scanning the grove. The pines swayed gently in the morning wind. The forest bathed in soft light that seemed too ordinary after the terror of the night. There was no sign of what had screamed, no tracks, no disturbances in the underbrush, nothing to suggest another human, or anything else, had been moving through those trees. I circled the clearing, searching for some explanation, some remnant of the horrors I had heard, but the ground was pristine, covered in dew and fallen needles as though nothing had happened. I packed up quickly, unease prickling in my chest with every snap of a buckle or rustle of my pack. As I made my way down the ridge trail, I kept glancing back, half expecting the pines to twist and shift, to reveal some dark shape standing just beyond visibility, but nothing followed, nothing emerged. And yet I felt the echo of that night pressing against me, even as the miles fell behind me and the familiar roads and human settlements returned. I could hear it, the faintest memory of screams threading through the rustle of pine needles, like a song buried deep in the forest. I never returned to that grove, and I rarely hike alone in those mountains anymore. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear the cries carried on the wind through the trees near my home. It's never as loud, never as clear, but it lingers, a memory with a life of its own. I think about the impossibility of it, how the forest seemed to rearrange itself, how the screams came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And I wonder if some part of those pines still holds the night, a quiet archive of terror that will whisper again for anyone who wanders too far into their shadow. Even now, the memory of that night leaves me restless. I hear the slightest wind through the trees and feel my pulse quicken, imagining cries echoing through the darkness, impossible to locate, always out of reach. There is no closure, no explanation, just the weight of what I heard. A reminder that the mountains are older than we are and hold secrets we are never meant to fully understand. The screaming pines stay with me, stitched into my memory. A quiet, persistent horror that refuses to let me forget the night I was so utterly, terrifyingly alone. Story 5, Eyes in the Midnight Clearing. I woke abruptly sometime after midnight, stirred by a strange stillness that pressed over the clearing like a weight. Normally, the woods around my campsite were alive with the subtle chorus of nocturnal creatures, the rustle of leaves, the occasional distant hoot of an owl, the scurrying of small animals in the underbrush. But that night, everything had stopped. The air felt thicker, almost humid in a way that made my chest ache, and the usual nighttime sounds were replaced by a silence so absolute it was almost audible. I lay in my sleeping bag for a few long minutes, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, that maybe my ears were simply playing tricks, when a faint glimmer caught my eye. At first, I thought it was the reflection of my own flashlight somewhere in the distance, but when I focused, I realized the points of light weren't moving erratically. They were deliberate, slow, steady, like dozens of small eyes staring at me from just beyond the tree line. My stomach knotted and a cold fear crept through me. I fumbled for my flashlight, flicking it on and sweeping the beam across the clearing, but the light only revealed shifting shadows, dark shapes where the forest floor should have been visible. Every time I blinked or turned my head even slightly, the lights seemed to move closer, slowly closing in, never darting, never erratic, just patient and deliberate. I forced myself to sit up, clutching my gear as though it could somehow protect me, and scanned the surrounding trees again. There was nothing but dark trunks and patches of undergrowth, the fog of the night masking any possibility of movement. The lights remained, glimmering faintly, reflecting off leaves and brush, always at the edges of my vision, just out of reach of understanding. I considered calling out, but the silence seemed to swallow my voice before it could even leave my lips. The thought that I was not alone, that something or someone was observing me from the shadows, pressed down on me like the weight of the mountains themselves. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt impossible to measure in that frozen, still darkness. Every sound, every slight snap of a branch made my pulse hammer against my ribs. I imagined shapes moving just beyond the glow, circling, patient, waiting. I kept the flashlight trained on the points of light, unable to tear my gaze away, though my arm began to ache from holding it steady. The lights never blinked, never wavered, never receded, and yet, when I dared to move the beam, the shadows would shift, leaving empty patches where the eyes had been, only for them to reappear moments later in new positions. I tried to rationalize it. Fireflies, reflections from dew, eyes of nocturnal animals. But nothing in my experience fit what I was seeing. The intensity, the number, the way the lights seemed aware of me, it wasn't natural. My mind raced, searching for explanation, but the forest offered none. I felt utterly exposed, small and fragile in the center of the clearing, watched by eyes I could neither locate nor understand. My breathing came fast and shallow, and I realized I hadn't moved a muscle in what felt like hours, frozen by fear and fascination alike. Eventually, exhaustion settled into my limbs, heavy and unyielding, but I could not sleep. I huddled in my sleeping bag, flashlight beside me, ears straining for any sound that might reveal what was out there. The points of light never left. Sometimes they seemed to flicker in the shadows, disappearing briefly behind a tree, only to reappear in a slightly different place. I could feel my mind beginning to fray, the solitude of the woods pressing into my consciousness. And the realization that I might be completely alone yet completely watched left me cold. I thought of every horror story I had ever heard about the mountains, about feral people, about things that lived in the forest unseen, and for the first time, I understood the kind of helplessness those tales hinted at. When the first hints of dawn began to appear, a pale, grey light filtering through the treetops, the points of light slowly faded one by one, until the clearing seemed normal again. Birds began to stir, a breeze rustled the needles, and the normal soundtrack of the forest returned as though nothing had happened. I crawled out of my tent cautiously, scanning every shadow, expecting to see some remnant of whatever had been there, some footprints, some movement in the underbrush. But there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed, save for the small patches of flattened grass where I had lain, and the trees were as ordinary as I had always known them. I packed up silently, my hands shaking, the memory of those unblinking lights burning in my mind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting them to reappear. But the clearing remained empty. I retraced my path down the ridge, careful with every step, eyes darting to the edges of the forest, heart hammering in my chest. Even as I returned to the familiar roads and cabins beyond the mountains, I could not shake the feeling of being observed. Every dark corner, every shadow, every flicker of light in the distance reminded me of that night, and the memory of those silent, patient eyes refused to fade. Years later, I still carry the unease with me. When I return to those woods, even in daylight, I feel the weight of that night pressing down. I can hear the rustle of pine needles in the wind and almost see the faint glimmers at the edges of my vision, just as they were that night. I tell myself I must have imagined it, that it was the combination of isolation, darkness, and fatigue. And yet, the certainty I felt then, the cold realization that something was observing me, that I was not as alone as I thought, lingers with a clarity that reason cannot erase. The memory of those eyes, unblinking, unyielding, circling in the shadows, haunts me quietly. And I know that in those Appalachian forests, some part of the darkness remembers, waits, and watches. Even now, in my home far from the mountains, I hear the faintest rustle of pine needles on the wind, and the memory comes flooding back. I can still feel their presence at the edges of my vision, always there, patient, persistent. I do not know what it was that night, and I fear I never will. The forest is older than we are, and some things that dwell within it are meant to remain unknowable. But the impression they leave, the quiet terror, the unnerving certainty of being watched, it stays with you, etched into memory, a shadow that refuses to fade. Story 6. The Vanishing Campsite. I set out that morning thinking it would be just another routine hike, the kind I'd done countless times in these Appalachian hills. The sun was slanting through the trees in the late afternoon when I finally decided to turn back toward my campsite. I had been gone for hours, exploring a ridge I'd never bothered to climb before, and the familiar sense of relief at returning to familiar ground settled over me. But when I broke through the final line of pines and stepped into the clearing where my tent should have been, it wasn't there. Not only was it gone, but the small fire ring I'd made was barely visible, scattered with smudges of ash and broken twigs, like someone had trampled over it and moved on. My gear, backpack, water bottles, even the small cooler with my dinner, was strewn around in a way that made no sense. Some items were overturned, others piled neatly in corners, almost as if someone had been sorting through them and lost interest halfway. I froze, a creeping chill crawling up my spine, telling me this wasn't just some trick of memory or wind. Something had happened here. At first, I thought I might have set up my tent somewhere else without realizing it. The woods can be deceptive, ridges look the same, clearings blur together when you're tired. I retraced my steps in my head, trying to remember the exact patch of moss and rocks I'd chosen, but nothing fit. My stomach twisted with unease. Then I noticed the footprints, shallow, smeared impressions in the soft dirt leading into the forest. They were human, maybe, but not quite. The stride seemed uneven, and the size shifted from one step to the next, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them didn't walk naturally. There were no return tracks. Nothing circled back to the clearing. I followed them a short distance, hoping to find an explanation, and that's when I saw it. A branch, snapped almost at knee height, with deep gouges carved into the wood. The bark was stripped jaggedly, like claws or some tool had been forced through it. I called out, my voice cracking in the stillness, but all that answered was the whisper of leaves. The forest felt impossibly dense, closed in. Birds that should have been settling for the evening had gone silent, and the wind that rustled through the higher pines was gone too, leaving a suffocating hush. Every step I took felt wrong, as if I were walking into a space that didn't exist for me, but for something else. Small signs of struggle appeared with alarming regularity. Shallow depressions in the dirt, splintered branches, patches of disturbed moss, but no clear pattern. Nothing made sense. It was like the forest had absorbed the campsite and rearranged itself around a story I couldn't read. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. I'd lost track. I wandered in circles, my head swiveling at every creak and snap of distant wood, imagining movement just beyond my vision. There were sounds, soft, dragging noises, almost like someone shuffling through underbrush. Every time I thought I'd found a direction, the evidence seemed to vanish, leaving only my own footsteps as proof I'd been anywhere at all. My energy was waning, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow could be the source of the footprints, every rustle of leaves a signal that I wasn't alone. As darkness fell fully, I finally stumbled into a tiny clearing I hadn't noticed before, flattened by old leaves and pine needles. It was far from ideal, but exhaustion pressed me down, and I couldn't force myself to keep moving. I constructed a crude bed from branches and fallen leaves. Wrapping my sleeping bag around me, I sat in silence, listening to the forest shift around me. The night sounds returned slowly, an owl calling somewhere in the distance, the faint scurrying of a raccoon. But the feeling of eyes on me never left. Every crack of a twig felt like a footstep. Every rustle like someone circling just beyond the edge of light. Morning came, though it didn't feel like the relief it should have. I woke to sunlight piercing the trees, birds singing as if nothing had happened, and a complete return to normalcy. The footprints were gone. The broken branches were just branches. The ground where my campsite had been, the ground I had been so certain was defiled and disturbed, was perfect, as if no one had been there at all. I returned to where I thought I'd set up, expecting at least some remnant of the chaos, but the clearing was untouched, the moss smooth, the fire ring clean and empty. I stood there, hands on my knees, trying to reconcile what I'd experienced with what my eyes now told me. Nothing added up. It took weeks before I could even mention it to anyone without sounding insane. Friends and fellow hikers said it could have been a misremembered location, a simple hallucination born of fatigue, stress, or hunger. I told myself maybe they were right, but the memory lingers, more vivid than any doubt. The footprints, the gouged trees, the scattered supplies, the heavy, suffocating air that made me feel watched and small. And even now, when I hike these woods, I carry that unease with me. I notice the subtle changes, slightly shifted rocks, unfamiliar clearings, the occasional crooked tree, and my stomach knots with the sense that the forest is far larger, stranger, and more alive than I could ever understand. I never returned to that exact spot, and I can't even be sure it exists anymore. Some days I wonder if I really was in the woods at all, or if that night was a kind of waking nightmare, a memory conjured from some deep, instinctual fear I've carried all my life. Yet when I close my eyes at night, I can see it as clearly as I saw it then. The empty clearing, the gouged trees, the gear scattered in impossible arrangements, the feeling that I was never truly alone. I can still feel the weight of whatever was watching me, something patient, something deliberate. The forest around me hums with life now, and yet I know it hides things that are older, quieter, and infinitely less forgiving than any animal I've ever known. Even after all this time, I can't shake the sense that the clearing, the campsite, whatever it was, remains out there, waiting for me or anyone else to stumble in, to disturb the subtle order that belongs to it alone. And I know, deep down, that part of me hopes I never find it again. The Appalachian woods are alive in ways that defy logic, and some spaces are not meant to be revisited. I learned that lesson too late, and I carry it with me. The memory of a place that vanished as if it had never existed, leaving behind only the terror of its absence. Story 7. The Stranger by the Stream. I remember the morning sun cutting through the misty valleys, the way it gilded the pines with a soft, amber glow, and how that beauty made the forest feel safe, almost forgiving. I'd been hiking the backwoods trails for 2 days, carrying only a light pack and a sense of restless curiosity that had brought me deeper than I ever usually ventured. By late afternoon, I reached a quiet bend in the creek where the water ran clear over smooth stones, and I decided to fill my water bottle and rest. The place felt empty in a way that was rare for these mountains. No birds calling, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the distant sound of water and my own breathing. It was at that moment I saw him, or maybe it was her, or something else entirely, sitting on a rock downstream. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even shift to acknowledge me, just stared. At first I thought it was another hiker, maybe a local who'd walked the trails in silence for years, but there was something off. The posture was too still, the presence too deliberate, as if it belonged to the forest itself. I froze, gripping my bottle like a lifeline, and for a long moment I considered turning back, pretending I hadn't seen anything. But curiosity, or perhaps foolishness, got the better of me. I stepped closer, keeping my eyes on that motionless silhouette, and felt the air grow colder despite the fading warmth of the sun. Every step I took felt amplified, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot like a trumpet announcing my intrusion. And then, just as I was about to call out, it vanished. There was no rustling of leaves, no sound of running. It simply wasn't there anymore. My pulse spiked, a low, anxious hum that seemed to fill my ears, and I scanned the surrounding trees but only found the swaying shadows of the pines. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was a trick of the light, a trick of exhaustion and hunger. But later that evening, as I returned to my tent, the unease tightened in my chest. Muddy footprints circled my campsite, some small, some larger, pressed into the damp earth, meandering as though someone or something had paused, considered their surroundings, and then left in every direction except the obvious path. There was no sign of anyone, no trace of movement beyond the prints themselves. My stomach knotted, a primal warning I couldn't ignore. I double-checked my tent, the gear stacked inside, and everything was intact. But still, that quiet certainty pressed in on me. I had not been alone. The night fell heavy, thicker than any I had known. The usual chorus of nocturnal life had dulled, replaced by a tense stillness, punctuated only by the faint gurgle of the creek. I lay awake, listening to the wind weave through the trees, imagining shapes circling just beyond the weak beam of my flashlight. Every snap of a twig or shift of leaves made me flinch. Shadows seemed to stretch and lean toward me, twisting into forms that vanished when I blinked. And in the distance I thought I saw the faint outline of the figure again, standing just where the last patch of moonlight touched the forest floor, silent, unblinking, patient. I tried to keep rational, tell myself it was another hiker, a hunter maybe, someone who lived in the mountains and moved like a ghost. But there was something in the posture, in the stillness, that refused to be explained. No human waits for hours in silence just to watch. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't waiting at all. It was observing, cataloguing, or perhaps marking. Each night after, the sightings repeated. Always distant, always fleeting, and yet unmistakable. Sometimes it would appear in the faint glow of dawn when the mist hung low over the creek. Other times, at dusk, in the corner of my vision while I adjusted my cooking gear. Every time I looked directly, it was gone, and each time my heart would hammer, my chest tight with fear I couldn't explain, and my mind spiraled with questions I had no answers for. I began to avoid certain areas of the forest, taking longer, indirect paths back to my camp. Yet no matter what I did, there was a sense that the forest itself had grown different, rearranged in subtle ways I could not articulate. One night, desperate for rest, I decided to sleep with the tent flaps slightly open, hoping the openness would make me feel less trapped. I awoke to the sound of water rushing over stones, soft at first, then sharper, as though the creek itself had intensified around me. And there it was again, the figure, standing across the creek, its presence almost magnetic. I froze, and the figure remained motionless, silent, unblinking. I wanted to call out, to confront it, but my throat was paralyzed with a fear that was as much instinct as reason. After what felt like hours, it tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly, then melted into the trees once more. By the last morning, I could no longer endure it. I packed my things hastily, the sense of being watched pressing down with every step. Even as I hiked away, keeping my eyes glued to the path ahead, I felt the weight of those silent eyes on my back, never leaving, never blinking. When I finally reached the parking area, the normal sounds of the forest seemed almost jarring, too bright, too loud, and I realized how deeply the tension had burrowed into me. I drove away, hands white on the wheel, refusing to look back. Even now, months later, the memory lingers. Sometimes, in quiet moments at home, I swear I see small points of light, fleeting in the corner of my vision, moving in the shadows of the trees near my property. I hear the faint rustle of leaves, the soft, deliberate crunch of steps on wet dirt, and I remember the patience of that presence. I cannot tell anyone what I saw. It sounds insane, and I cannot find words to describe the fear that was neither sudden nor violent, but slow, patient, and inescapable. The mountains are beautiful, and I loved them once, but now every creek, every grove, every stretch of pines carries a subtle dread I cannot shake, a reminder that something watched, something waited, and something remembered me long after I left. The fear is not gone, it has not faded, and perhaps it never will. Even now when the wind stirs the pines on a quiet evening, I feel it, the weight of those unblinking eyes just beyond my vision, and I wondered if somehow the forest still remembers me too. Story 8. The Howl on Raven Ridge. I remember the first night on Raven Ridge as if it's still vibrating under my skin, a low, insistent hum of dread that never really left. I had been hiking alone, craving the kind of isolation only the high Appalachian ridges can offer, where the air smells of wet pine and the earth beneath your boots seems alive in a slow, patient way. My campsite sat on a narrow shelf of rock overlooking a valley choked with mist. and as night fell, the usual chorus of crickets and tree frogs faded beneath a sudden, unnatural quiet. That's when I heard it. First, a single note, low and guttural, rolling across the ridgeline. At first, I thought it must be a coyote or some other predator, but the sound was wrong, impossible to place. It carried a cadence, a rhythm almost like breathing, deliberate and measured, and it seemed to be coming from every direction at once. I strained my ears, thinking maybe it was the wind, but the trees were still, not a leaf stirred. I tried to follow it, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had made the noise, and started along a narrow path that curled around the ridge. The terrain itself seemed hostile, shifting beneath my feet. Roots twisted in patterns that made no sense. Rocks were slick with damp moss, and every turn seemed to loop me back toward the sound rather than away from it. The howl came again, louder this time, deeper, almost resonating through the bones in my chest. I stopped moving, frozen, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, that the mountain's acoustics were playing tricks. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt wrong out there. The howl returned in a sequence that felt purposeful, as if whatever was out there could sense my presence and was responding. I whispered into the darkness, a nervous, futile greeting, and my voice seemed to vanish instantly. I had the uneasy sense that I was being studied, tracked by something patient, waiting for me to slip. My flashlight barely penetrated the blackness beyond the ridge, just a thin cone of familiarity in a wilderness that had suddenly become alien. Every crack of a branch, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. I wanted to leave, but the path back had vanished, or perhaps it had never been there. By midnight, I was huddled in my tent, yet the ridge seemed to pulse with sound, the howl repeating in that same deliberate cadence. I tried to reason it out. Maybe hunters, maybe a trapped animal, maybe an echo that played tricks on me. But every night I'd hiked, I'd never heard anything like this. It was wrong in a way I could feel in my chest, in the hair on my arms, in the tight knot of stomach tension that refused to relax. I told myself it was just a coincidence, just me alone in the dark with my imagination magnified by exhaustion. But the howl's timing, the way it matched my every movement, suggested otherwise. The next morning, I hiked down the ridge to find a small stream, hoping the sunlight and water would calm me. Birds were singing again, the world normal and benign, but the ridge loomed above me like a silent predator. The memory of the sound lingered in my mind, and I kept glancing back, expecting to see something or someone emerge from the tree line. Nothing came, of course. The forest seemed empty, almost hospitable in the daylight, yet my skin prickled with a sense of being watched. Nightfall brought the howl again, predictably, as if it had been waiting for darkness to resume its ritual. I barely slept, curling my sleeping bag around me, listening as the sound rose and fell, sometimes close, sometimes far, never random. Each repetition left me more paranoid, more convinced that the mountain itself had eyes and ears, and I was trespassing in a space that was alive with sentience. I would hear twigs breaking behind the ridge, then nothing. Shadows stretched across the terrain in ways that didn't align with the moon or my flashlight, and I found myself talking to the empty night just to keep my own voice company. I started trying to map the sound, moving cautiously along the ridge each evening, following the howl's irregular patterns, but it became maddening. The further I went, the less the terrain resembled what I'd hiked in daylight. Slopes became impossible, trees loomed at odd angles, and trails I had marked earlier were gone. It felt as though the ridge itself was rearranging, responding to my intrusion. I would stumble upon broken branches, crushed underfoot in ways that suggested more than a single animal had passed through. Once, I saw shallow depressions in the dirt, too large to be my own and too shallow to be human footprints. Every instinct told me to leave, yet I couldn't find a way down without passing the ridge where the howl waited. I never saw anyone, never saw anything beyond the rhythm of sound and the shifting shadows, yet I could feel the presence of something deliberate. My mind oscillated between reason and fear, and I realized that I no longer trusted my own senses. The ridge, the howl, the woods. They had begun to dictate my movements, my rest, my very breathing. I stopped setting up camp at the same spot, moving each night in a circuit that seemed designed to confuse the watcher, or perhaps confuse myself. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest had become a mirror reflecting my own rising panic, and the howl was the pulse keeping me in check. By the fourth night, exhaustion made me reckless. I left my tent at the edge of the ridge, trying to descend in desperation. The howl followed, louder and sharper now, and I felt it in my chest like a hammering drum. My flashlight flickered, and shadows seemed to twist around me, elongating and contracting with the rhythm of the sound. I tripped over roots, slid down moss-covered rocks, and felt something brush past my arm, soft, fast, inhuman. But when I turned, there was nothing. My heart pounded so violently I was convinced it would betray me to whatever was stalking the ridge. Dawn finally came, pale and grey, and I stumbled into a clearing at the base of the mountain where the world seemed ordinary again. Birds sang, a gentle breeze moved through the trees, and the ridge looked inert, no more than a pile of stone and timber. I looked back, half expecting the forest to erupt with movement, but the howl had gone, leaving only silence. I kept hiking, heading back to the nearest road, but the image of the ridge and the sound itself stayed with me. Every creak in my apartment floor, every distant howl in the night brings me back there. I can't explain it, can't rationalize it, and I've never returned. The ridge sits in my memory, a pulse at the edge of hearing, a deliberate rhythm that reminds me I was never really alone, even when I was the only person in sight. The sound didn't belong to anything I can name, and I'm not sure I want to know what it was, but it changed me. Raven Ridge waits up there still, calling in that low, guttural cadence, and I can't shake the feeling that it will recognize me if I ever go back. Story 9. Shadows Under the Old Bridge. I didn't expect much from that little stretch of creek, just a quiet spot to stretch my legs and refill my water bottle before hiking further into the ridge. The day had been long, the kind where the sun burns your back and your boots grind against loose gravel until every step feels like a punishment. The bridge came into view as the forest thinned, an old wooden span arching over the water. Its planks were grey and slick with moss, the railings warped and splintered, but it called to me in a way that I can't quite explain, like the forest itself was pointing me toward it. At first, I noticed nothing unusual, just the water curling around the stones beneath, the muted hum of insects and distant birds. But then I saw them, or I thought I did. Shadows crouched low beneath the bridge, pressed close to the supports. My heart jumped, a cold jab that left my stomach hollow. They didn't move like any animal I knew. They seemed deliberate, watching. I froze, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks. The late afternoon sun casting long, restless patterns across the water. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they were gone. No rustle of leaves, no splash, just empty air where the shadows had been. I chalked it up to fatigue at first, a trick of the light, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. There was a weight there, something pressing against my awareness like the forest was holding its breath. I lingered a moment longer, scanning the tree line on either side, but saw nothing. That night I made camp farther upstream, close to a small clearing where the ground was flat and I could see the ridge above me. I slept fitfully, or at least I tried, but every half hour I woke to a scraping sound, like nails against dry wood, echoing from the direction of the bridge. At first, I convinced myself it was raccoons, maybe some deer scratching at the trees, but the pattern was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Sometimes it was accompanied by a faint whisper of my name, carried on a wind that didn't seem to exist. I lay there, ears straining, heart hammering, listening to the dark settle like a living thing around me. The next morning, I returned to the bridge. The shadows were back, though still fleeting, vanishing when I stepped closer. There were no prints in the mud, no sign of anyone actually crossing beneath it, yet the sense of being watched was undeniable. I explored the creek on either side, checking for caves, hollow logs, anything that could conceal someone, but the forest gave nothing. The planks of the bridge groaned under my weight as I leaned over the railings, peering into the dark water, and I had the distinct impression that someone or something was peering back. I felt eyes from beneath, too low for me to see, just out of reach, pressing up against the timber. The thought made my skin crawl, and I took a step back, heart racing, insisting to myself that it was nothing. That night, I camped closer to the creek, attempting to keep the bridge in view. The wind carried a strange, musty scent that didn't belong to the forest, and the scraping noises returned, this time higher up, from the bridge's decayed surface. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but there was an unnatural cadence to it, deliberate enough to unnerve me. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow beyond the firelight seemed to stretch and move with intent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge had become a vantage point. Someone, or something, was studying me. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, shivering despite the heat, every snapping twig and falling leaf twisting my nerves tighter. Over the next 2 days, the creek became a maze of unease. I avoided the bridge, circling upstream and downstream in hopes of finding another crossing. Each time I dared glance back, the shadows seemed to linger, crouch low, holding still long enough for me to wonder if they were human. I told myself to stop imagining things, to focus on the trail, on my map, but the forest seemed to twist around me. Paths I had just hiked appeared unfamiliar, as though the trees themselves were rearranging to trap me in this small section of the creek. Every night the scraping continued. Every night the whispers teased my name just out of reach. I started moving my camp farther from the bridge each day, desperate to shake the feeling of eyes tracking me. On the third night, I stayed on the ridge, away from the creek entirely. From my small clearing, I could see the bridge in the distance, black and silent. I didn't hear the scraping, not immediately. But I sensed something else, a weight, a presence, a tension that gripped the air and pressed against me like cold stone. I tried to convince myself that I was leaving in the morning, that this was just stress, fatigue, the usual anxieties of a solitary hike. Yet even from that distance I could swear the shadows were waiting, crouched in stillness beneath the old wood, patient and unmoving. I couldn't tell if it was one figure or many. It didn't matter. The forest had claimed the bridge, and through it claimed me. Morning came, grey and muted, and I packed quickly, eyes darting toward the creek, toward the bridge. For a moment I thought I saw movement, but when I blinked, there was nothing. No shadows, no figures, just the normal creek, the normal forest. I walked fast, not daring to look back, heart pounding in a rhythm that seemed synced with every rustle and bird call. When I finally reached the dirt road, I paused, glancing over my shoulder. The bridge looked ordinary, abandoned, harmless. Yet I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. The weight of eyes, the deliberate watching, the scraping that had pierced the quiet of the nights. Even now, back in my apartment, away from the mountains and the creek, I can't shake it. Every time I close my eyes, I see the shadows crouched beneath the bridge, waiting, I can feel the rhythm of those deliberate movements, the unseen presence pressing against the edges of perception. I don't tell many people. They would think I'm exaggerating, that it was a trick of light, exhaustion, or paranoia. But I know the truth. The old bridge isn't just wood and nails. It's a place where someone, or something, waits, patient and quiet, ready for the next traveler who ventures too close. I'll never hike that ridge again. I'll never cross that creek. And sometimes when the wind blows through the trees outside my window, I swear I hear the faint scrape of nails against wood, just beyond the edge of my hearing, and it makes my chest tighten, remembering the way the shadows had watched me and the way they are still, somehow, waiting. Story 10. The rustling that followed me. I remember the day I packed up for what was supposed to be my last hike in that stretch of the Appalachian backcountry. The morning had that cold clarity only early October can bring, the air crisp and biting, the sun angled so low it made the trees look like they were painted in gold and shadow. I had my pack ready, a light breakfast eaten in the clearing near my tent, and a sense of relief that this trip was ending. Still, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a subtle tension in my shoulders, a whisper of unease that I chalked up to solitude. That feeling grew the instant I stepped onto the narrow trail, heading down the ridge that would eventually lead me back to the main road. It started as a faint rustling in the brush, a sound that could easily have been a squirrel, a deer, or some other common woodland creature. But there was a rhythm to it, a precise mimicry of my steps that set my nerves on edge. Every crunch of leaves beneath my boots was echoed, always just behind me. I stopped to listen, holding my breath, but all I could hear was the wind through the oaks and maples, and that persistent, shadowed rustle. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after days alone. But the instinct to keep moving forward, fast, was overwhelming. I altered my pace, stepping faster, doubling back, even cutting through a thinner path parallel to the first. The rustling followed exactly, never faltering, never slowing. My heart started to pound in that unmistakable rhythm of panic, the kind that makes your hands shake and your stomach tighten until it feels like you might collapse. I dared a glance over my shoulder and just for a fraction of a second saw something humanoid, tall, thin, and impossibly still, standing just beyond the trees. It vanished the moment my eyes met it, leaving only the swaying branches and the crunch of leaves. My stomach dropped, a sharp twist of fear that made me wish I could be anywhere else. The trail narrowed as I descended, steep rocks and twisted roots making every step a test of balance. Still, the sound kept pace. Sometimes it sounded like it was brushing against the tree trunks, sometimes like it was crawling through the leaves and underbrush in a way no human could easily manage. I forced myself to keep moving, my pack pressing against my shoulders, my legs tight with tension. I told myself over and over that the mountains were empty, that I was alone, but deep down I knew that what I was hearing was deliberate, watching, tracking me. There's a difference between a natural sound and one that feels like it's waiting, anticipating, and this one was deliberate. By late afternoon, the sun had dipped behind the peaks, leaving shadows that seemed too dark for the fading light. I stopped near a small creek to refill my water bottle, the sound of water running over smooth rocks offering a brief reprieve. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. Crouching at the bank and dipping the bottle in, that's when I heard it again. A soft step behind me, then a brush of leaves, a pause, and the subtle exhale of air that didn't match the wind. I spun, but the trees were empty. Nothing. Only the rustling, always just out of sight, like something living in the spaces where the light didn't reach. My hands trembled as I filled the bottle, my mind racing with every horror story I'd ever dismissed as fiction. The trail grew darker the further I went. The mountains have a way of twisting your perception. Ridges curve unexpectedly. Streams appear where none should be, and the forest seems endless. Every shadow made me flinch. Every wind-stirred leaf sounded like footsteps. I began speaking to myself aloud, almost begging my mind to rationalize it, but the answers came hollow. "It's an animal," I said, "just an animal." Yet the movements I glimpsed, always fleeting, were too deliberate, too human. I caught myself stepping silently through patches of leaves, trying not to draw attention, but I knew that whatever followed was patient. It didn't hurry, it didn't falter. It simply existed in the periphery of my vision, always waiting for me to slip. Night came sooner than I expected. By the time I reached a ridge with a view of the valley below, the sky had deepened to a bruised purple, the last of the sun bleeding behind the peaks. I set up my small emergency shelter, keeping a fire barely lit in a shallow pit. I dared not sit fully, not fully relax. Every snapping twig, every creak of the trees made me tense. The rustling came again, closer now but still unseen. I thought I heard a whisper, my name almost carried on the wind, but dismissed it as delirium, my mind fraying from fear and exhaustion. Still, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't close my eyes without imagining the shape of that humanoid figure crouched just beyond the tree line, its gaze fixed on me, unwavering. I left before dawn the next morning, moving quickly and without pause. Every step I took, the rustling followed. Every shadow of a tree seemed like a potential hiding spot. I never stopped until I was back on the main road, my pack soaked with sweat despite the cold, my hands blistered from gripping my walking stick too tightly. Only then, in the safety of my car and the sun cresting the peaks, did I allow myself to breathe properly. But even as I drove away, the sense of being watched lingered in my chest. It stayed with me on every quiet trail, in every isolated forest I visited afterward. Even now, months later, I find myself hesitating at the edges of dense woods, ears straining for the slightest irregularity. A rustle behind me, a snap of a branch, a shadow that seems too deliberate. I tell myself it was just a fleeting glimpse of a person, a local perhaps, following the trail out of curiosity, but I know better. There was something there that day, patient, silent, and unafraid, something that mirrored my every movement, calculating, waiting, and though I've never returned to that part of the Appalachians, I can still hear it in my memory, the faint, persistent rustling that followed me all the way down the ridge, like a reminder that the mountains aren't always empty, that solitude has a price, and that sometimes being watched doesn't end when you think you're safe. I haven't gone back. I don't plan to. But in the deepest silence of any forest, when the wind is still and the leaves barely move, I can still hear it behind me, always behind me. And I know that somewhere, just beyond where the light fades, it waits, patient, watching, silent,